Hello, and welcome to the Feet on the Soil podcast, the podcast about the world beneath our feet and how we interact with it. So I hope you guys all enjoyed last week's episode about insects, and I know it was a little bit depressing. Even when I was researching for it, I found myself getting into a bit of a spiral of just not feeling too great about the natural world while learning about what we're doing to it. Now today, we're going to continue our chat about insects, but hopefully this one's a little bit lighter. This week we're talking to Nessa Darcy, the creative entomologist, and we're talking about everything from why we should care about insects, the kind of natural beauty that they hold, and even some of the insect surveys that Nessa has performed on the River Dodder. Nessa is a Dublin-based creative entomologist. Her mission is to reintroduce humans to their natural habitat through colourful encounters with insects. Over the past decade, that has included bug-centric learning experiences, socially and environmentally engaged art practices, and biodiversity surveys for conservation management. She teaches people about insects mainly through the Heritage in School scheme, libraries, community gardens, and her training course for primary school teachers at Europass Teaching Academy. Her involvement with Ireland's leading intercultural choir, Discovery Gospel Choir, has given her the opportunity to work with asylum seekers, incarcerated people, and faith-based groups. Now that she is studying ecotherapy with Tariki Trust, she hopes to offer more chances for people to experience the positive impact that time spent with insects can have on our well-being. We recorded this interview at the River Dodder in a section of wet woodlands just outside of Fir House. It's an area that I actually used to go to as a kid and a teenager just to cause mischief and run around, but I found myself here on very different pretenses today. The area itself also held importance for Nessa. As we get into in the episode, it's a site where she has performed insect surveys in the past and found some really rare insects. The whole conversation made me kind of rethink the area and rethink my kind of experience with it. As I walked around knowing that rare insects were all around me, I just had to kind of look in the right places to find them. We recorded this episode in February, so it wasn't exactly the height of insect numbers, but now that we find ourselves well away into spring and really coming into summer, the insects have really started to come alive. Even this morning on a little walk down to the bottom of the garden, I was seeing bumblebees, butterflies, woodlice, slugs, everything that we talked about within this episode. And I suppose now more than ever, it's a good time to listen in and kind of learn what to look out for and why these things matter. I'm going to try and keep today's intro a bit shorter than usual because I think the content of the conversation that's what you're here for, and it's a really good one. So thank you for listening, and thank you to Nessa for this fantastic conversation that you're about to hear. Being the creative entomologist, I think one of the most important things is that we learn, how did you first get fascinated with insects?
That's a difficult one to answer because I can't remember a time when I wasn't fascinated with insects. So I think it all started when I was very, very small. There are stories of me picking up slugs and terrifying the neighbours with them. These are neighbours who, when the frogs escaped from our garden, they used to bring them back to us in a cup. So...
not nature lovers.
Not nature knowers, okay. Maybe. But yeah, I think it all started very early. And then I went in school, I kind of went more in the direction of art. There was always kind of a choosing between whether I would do art or something to do with animals. I went to art college, and then after art college, which I loved, and I'm glad I did, sort of found being an artist a little bit of a lonely career. So I kind of did some volunteering with wildlife, then eventually did my master's, and it was then when I did my beetle research, my first beetle research that I remembered just how much I love insects. And
when you're a kid, you just love insects. You love going out into the garden and turning over stones or peeling the bark off a tree to see what you can find. And it always seems like people lose that love, and some people rediscover it. Some people don't. What do you think it is that really kept you interested in insects and kind of stopped you from losing that love for them?
I think it was definitely encouraged by my parents. So they say they don't actually know how I learned about insects because they claim they don't know anything about them themselves. But I was definitely allowed when we were like out on walks or on holidays. I was allowed plenty of time to walk with my head down and towards the ground looking for tiny things. I was also given a book by my friend's mum. It was like a wildlife book, but it was like for grown-ups. It had proper nature information in it, and I think that was what really helped. Like that really helped to hold my attention and get me really interested in nature, because I think sometimes what is available to kids to learn about insects can be a bit oversimplified.
Okay.
Maybe not nowadays, now that we have like YouTube videos and things. But I remember when I was probably in my early 20s and I found out that there wasn't just a bumblebee and a honeybee. There was like 100 species of bees in Ireland, and nobody had told me. I felt cheated. So, yeah, so just support from my parents. And also, we were talking about the Dublin Naturalist Field Club earlier. My parents brought me to those outings and meetings, and there were a couple of members that were particularly supportive. One has, like Declan Duke, has also been really supportive to me in my adult life with my studies and my surveys and things. Me and my siblings always used to win a prize for bringing in our our stick insects or our giant African land snails or whatever we'd collected for Members' Day. So that certainly helped.
As you said, you went initially into art and studied that, and then kind of have incorporated that into your love of wildlife, and now do work with schools where I suppose you're kind of supporting the next generation of people who might be interested. What kind of inspired you to combine art and your love of the outdoors, or was it kind of just a natural thing that happened?
My mum predicted it. she was like,
mothers always know.
Yeah, they do. She knew I was going to do something that combined biological stuff with art stuff. And I remember when she kind of first said it, I think I was so overwhelmed with whatever I was doing at the time. I was like, I can barely do what I'm one at a time. How could I possibly do them both? I don't really know the answer to that question. I think, how did it come about? I don't know. It just must have happened just naturally at some point.
It was just,
Yeah.
you already had that fascination, so it was just going to be the thing that you wanted to create, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah, when I was working with organizations, nature-based organizations like the Owls Children's Nature Club, that was sort of a skill that I could offer. So I would help with doing creative activities with the kids, or I think I made, I designed the membership certificate with all the animals. All the different leaders have different animal names, so I put all their animal pictures on it. And I was in the process of making them an insect identification chart, but I actually got so into it, it took me too long and I never finished it. But I made some really nice pictures of insects. So I think, there was always kind of an overlap, because insects are so visually interesting anyway. It's almost, there was definitely a gap at one point where I didn't make art, because I was like, how could I compete with nature? Because nature is such an incredible artist, and nothing I can make will ever be as incredible as these insects. And then after that gap, I realized I needed to make art in order to survive. I don't mean financially, I mean just spiritually and emotionally. Yeah, it's something, there's some kind of urge in me to make art that will probably, hopefully, never go away. So, yeah.
Like you said, it is hard to compete with what nature has already created, like whether that be something very classically beautiful like a butterfly, or a particularly colourful moth, or even something down to the scale of beetles and ants. They've just got this look to them that interests us from when we're kids. Do you find that when you're trying to communicate the importance of insects to younger people, that using that kind of visual aspect allows them to kind of understand it a bit more, to get into it, rather than just telling them the facts of like, this is a pollinator, this is a decomposer?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think the difference when you show a child something under the microscope, their drawings transform into something completely different, and they also just see, when they get to meet insects close up, they start to see them as people, and they form a personal attachment to them, personal relationship with them, which is one of the main goals of my work. And they always give them names. There's always a few Jeremys, Bobbies, Jims, Jeffs. There's always a Jeff. I don't know why. Some of my workshops focus on sort of how insects use their senses to communicate. There's a lot of visual communication. Okay. So you have like moths, like camouflaging or using bright colors, spots and stripes and black and orange to scare things away. And the kids seem to find that really interesting. It gives them nice inspiration to make really cool art as well.
Yeah, I think it'd be hard for a kid to see like an elephant hawk moth and not want to create something amazing, or like a monarch butterfly or anything like that. You were saying that the kids kind of begin to assign personalities and they name these animals. Do you see a difference in the kind of the before and after of when you first meet a group compared to the end in how they want to treat the kind of the world around them, even wider than insects?
That's a tough one to answer because of that. Because of the fact that I don't usually get to work with them for more than one day. But I definitely, this is a story I tell in every interview that I do. It's really stuck with me. But there was one class, well, there are often pupils in a class that are disgusted by insects and they don't want to touch them, and they're revolting and they're scared of them, and they insist they're not going to go anywhere near them. And as soon as those kids meet them face to face and learn a few interesting facts about them, they're always totally fine with them. But there was one really major transformation where like the girl was really, really disgusted with bugs. And then it turned out she just hadn't met the right bug yet, because she met some crane fly larvae, which are like, by human standards, they're probably the least aesthetically pleasing bugs you could imagine. They're these little grubby, they live in the mud, so they look grubby, and they have these little protrusions coming out of one end of them. And she'd found 2 of them and named them and fallen in love with them and wanted to take them home. She's grown so attached to them. Yeah, I do think they get the message. I usually try to explain to them that what kinds of things insects need, like different kinds of food plants and untidy habitats where they can hide and nest and hibernate. I think they do sort of get the idea, and they want to make these places for the insects to live, and they want to go and search and find more places where insects live. So yeah, I hope that sticks with them.
Like I remember when I was a kid, it was more so reptiles. Every primary school would have some guy who would come around, and they would have a load of iguanas and leopard geckos and stuff. And at first you'd be a bit, I don't really want to go near the scaly thing. But then by the end, you were fascinated with them because you had learned a little bit about them. And I do want to talk to you a little bit about what you were saying there about kind of homes for insects and where they live. But I want to get to that a little bit later because, well, we have talked about how insects are visually quite appealing. They are also important in the environment for a variety of reasons. So pollination and decomposition. So I want to just ask you the question of kind of why is it that we should care about insects? What makes them important?
So first of all, I would say just if you don't yet love insects, if you don't yet care about insects, just spend some time with some, just like sitting peacefully with them and observing them, because then you'll figure out that they deserve to exist because they're amazing. But they are also absolutely essential to life on Earth. So they carry out a lot of the processes that just keep life going, like pollination, so that our plants can produce fruit and seeds and nuts and keep going from one generation to the next, and also provide food for us and for other animals. They're decomposers. So if we didn't have insects and other invertebrates, in fact, a lot of the decomposers are not insects. They're things like woodlice and millipedes and slugs. Then we would just be up to our eyes in dead things, which wouldn't be very pleasant. They'll like break down all the dead stuff and put it back into the soil as nutrients, which then feeds the plants that we rely on to eat. They'll keep each other in balance. So if we didn't have spiders and dragonflies and wasps, we'd have sort of an imbalance of the other things, some of which we're not very fond of, like disease-carrying flies or aphids that eat our crops. So having the full range of invertebrates around makes sure that everything sort of stays in balance. Like, we actually use them for a lot of other more obscure purposes, like silk, moths for creating fabric. There are insects and other invertebrates that are involved in healing us, like, so actual medical care. We still use leeches.
That's what I was about to
Yeah,
ask. Is
yeah.
it the leeches?
Leeches are still used to restore circulation, and things like Lucilia, greenbottle fly larvae. So we would see green bottles around. If it was not February, we would see green bottles around here on the flowers here in the Dodder wet woodland. They're a really common fly, and their larvae are really helpful in cleaning out infected wounds. So they will eat away the infected dead flesh, but they leave the healthy, clean flesh. And there isn't really any, we haven't really invented a more effective way of doing that ourselves.
And is that a common practice?
I've never heard of anyone actually having it done, but it is still a medicinal treatment, a medical treatment, yeah.
Okay. And at the start you were saying about how when you were in your 20s you felt you were lied to because you realised there was more than just honeybees and bumblebees. Are woodlice not insects?
Woodlice are crustaceans, actually.
All right. I never knew that.
Okay.
So more similar to
crabs and lobsters and shrimp. They've got 14 legs, and they came out of the sea. I'm really bad at remembering numbers, but I think it was 300 million years ago. And we've only been on Earth for 300,000 years.
Jesus,
so this is really woodlouse land.
Planet.
Yeah, exactly. Woodlouse planet.
They were my favorite. When I was growing up, the woodlouse was always my favorite insect because there was a big log or a big tree stump at the side of my house. And it was really weird because you could peel the bark off, but then when you let go, it just went back to where it was. And so I used to just check up, and I'd open up the little tree bark, and there was always just hundreds of woodlice in there. And I would just slowly put the bark back on, and then I would go about my day. And then a few weeks later, I'd come out and check on my little pet woodlice. And they were my favorite insect by far for a long time.
They're so good. Yeah. I didn't really think twice about them until a kid in one of my workshops asked me, is it true that woodlice carry their babies in a pouch like a kangaroo?
Is it?
And I was like, that's madness. This kid has just made this up. And then I told him I didn't know. But I then did some research into woodlice, and they have the weirdest, most interesting lives. I now have pet woodlice, and I have a workshop that I bring to libraries and schools that's just about woodlice because they're that interesting.
And do they carry their babies
in
a
pouch? They do, yeah. It's called a marsupium.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what other things? I want to know now. I love woodlice.
They've got rectangular poos.
Okay.
They're blue. Their blood is blue because it's copper based instead of iron based.
Okay, mad.
They can eat their own poo if they run out of food.
They're like kind of Bear Grylls, but
yeah,
the opposite.
Yeah. You can eat them as well.
Okay.
Yeah, if you're not allergic to crustaceans. So I imagine if you're allergic to shrimp, you probably shouldn't try them. Okay. But yeah, if you're ever stuck, you can eat your woodlice. And well, they're just really awesome decomposers. They'll eat pretty much anything dead and poo and each other's exoskeletons, and they're really good at cleaning up.
And obviously all of that, like whatever they're eating, whether it's plant life or anything like that, it's helping to enrich soils and make the woodlice planet a little bit better as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
Cool.
Oh, there's one more. This one has been questioned by the primary school kids that I teach, but they pee in gas form. So they, instead of peeing out liquids, they release ammonium through their exoskeleton as a sort of gas.
Mad.
And that's possibly why they get their names, like their pig-related names, like Sowbug, because they smell like a pigsty, apparently.
I presume if you have enough of them in one area, you get a smell off them. Jesus. Well, there you go. I mean, there was a reason why they were
and they can drink with their bums.
I can see that a lot of these facts, they are interesting, but they're definitely, to get kids interested. Because if I was a kid and you were like, yeah, they drink with their bums, I'd be like, okay, cool. That's
I am on board.
cemented. They're my
Yeah,
favorite
exactly.
insects. And so obviously now I know that woodlice are the most important thing in the world, and I love them. But as well as that, obviously the things that you listed, so pollination, decomposition, I suppose not climate control, but like pests, or not pests, insects almost act as like a natural pesticide as well. So
Yeah.
there's a variety of reasons why they're so important. What would you say are kind of the biggest challenges that insects face at the moment?
So, as we were talking about earlier, I think maybe because I'm so obsessed with insects, I tend to see things on like the small level, and policy and sort of the big scientific picture is not my strong point. But what I see from my own experience doing insect surveys and teaching people about insects and visiting various habitats is that one of the biggest challenges that they face here in Ireland is people over tidying their gardens and parks and covering their driveways in concrete and basically removing insect habitat. But it's also, I kind of also see it as one of the easiest things for us to fix. The problem is that we seem to equate our self-worth with how tidy our garden is.
Mm-hmm.
We just need to get more comfortable with the discomfort of having dead leaves under our trees and under our hedges, and letting the grass grow long and tussocky so things can overwinter in it and nest in it and lay their eggs in it and everything. And also letting what's in the soil grow, the really local wild plants, even if that's nettles and dock leaves and things that we've been kind of taught over the years are bad weeds. These are the things that the local insects need. A lot of insects will have specific food plants. While there is some benefit for pollinators of planting like pollinator-friendly flowers, if you don't also provide the specific food plants that the caterpillars of the butterflies and moths need, for example, then you're not going to get any of those species. Bee hotels are nice, sort of like a tool for educating people about solitary bees, and maybe a nice addition to have in amongst improved, don't like to use the word improved because improved grassland is so bad for insects. But a re-natured, a better habitat for insects, but again without the supporting habitat, bee hotels don't offer that much. Yeah, and I think for a while people sort of felt like having a bee hotel and planting a few pollinator flowers was enough for the insects. But I do think that people are starting to see that more is needed, and that people are letting their gardens grow wild, and people are accepting that county councils that are doing their job right are letting places grow wild and letting the wildflowers grow out in public parks as well. So yeah.
And I know a lot of times people can look up like how to make my garden better for wildlife, and 9 times out of 10 it will say something about buying a wildflower mix from your local garden centre and throwing that out. A lot of the times they'll say get a bee hotel or a beehive. I think people are starting to realise now that sometimes that isn't the best advice for helping your local wildlife. Do you have any tips that people could kind of easily incorporate into their garden as a kind of a starter to make it a little bit more insect friendly?
Yes, definitely. There are some very small, simple things that you can do, and water makes a huge difference. Like you can create a thing called a hoverfly lagoon, which is just basically a container with stagnant water and dead leaves in it, which hoverflies, some species of hoverflies will have their larvae in those. So the larvae will they have these kind of long tails. They're called rat-tailed maggots. They have these long tails that reach up to the surface so they can breathe underwater. And they'll live in amongst the stagnant water and the dead leaves and eat away in there until they're big enough to grow up into adult hoverflies and pollinators.
Like a built-in snorkel.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's cool.
So that's a really easy thing to make. And then just really leaving as much debris as you can handle having in your garden. So dead leaves, dead sticks, like if sticks fall off your trees, gather them up in a corner, make a little pile for the insects to live in. It is just really hard for me just to not just keep telling people just let your garden grow wild. But I know that's hard for some people to handle.
But even if it's just a section of the garden and the rest is pruned.
Even every small patch helps, because that's another little stepping stone between the other patches, and those connect up the sort of larger areas of wild habitat, like the woodlands that we're in right now. Yeah, so then maybe even like connecting with your neighbours so that everyone has the end of their garden wild. Then you've got a whole corridor all the way along your street. Dead logs. If a tree has fallen in the park and the council are going to take it away, see if you can get a chunk of that and put it in your garden, or see if you can get the council to leave it in the park, because rotting dead wood is actually like not, it's quite a scarce habitat. And there are things like certain kinds of beetles whose larvae live in dead wood and rotting wood. So they're becoming rarer because dead wood tends to be cleared away. It's a really, really important habitat.
I've seen more, even just in the last year, especially walking around some of the council parks, the likes of your Marley Parks and Bushy Park and stuff like that. I've started to see a lot more standing dead wood being left, and then also any trees that were downed in either the most recent storms or even just that kind of naturally fell, either they're on a riverbank or something like that. They're starting to be left in place a lot more. And you can see immediately that little area becomes a lot more diverse in its insect life, its bird life,
It's
everything.
true. And you get to see a lot of cool fungi growing on the dead log as well. Yeah. And my friend has been teaching me about bat roosts. So there's she showed me in Rascool Woodlands, which is also, I think, under South Dublin County Council.
I presume.
I think the proper name is the Four Districts Woodland in Rascool. And where the trees have been bent and broken in storms, there are little cracks in the branches.
Yeah.
And the bats can actually roost inside those. That's enough for them.
Nice.
And they have I think she said they can fit into like 2 millimeter wide gaps in trees.
I'm a big bat fan.
Yeah.
They're really cool. Even like the soprano pipestral, the smallest one that we have. It's only like the size of the first digit of your thumb. Like they're only very, very small, but they can eat about 3,000 insects a night each.
What?
So even, I suppose that's another benefit of the insects,
Yeah.
that they serve as a foodstuff for so many things. But yeah, so like even if you're in an area that has a couple roosts of bats, each one of those bats every night needs to come out to get about 3,000 insects, which is pretty insane.
And what do they eat? Midges?
Yeah, so I think it's a lot of, each species kind of has a separate kind of preference, I believe. But I think, say the likes of the Leisler, which is the largest bat that we have, they're big into their beetles. So they'll fly around for any night flying beetles.
My poor beetle friends.
Which is I guess there's a benefit of having the dead wood being around. You were saying that beetles breathe in there, and again you're supplying food to the whole web of animal life.
I forgot that part. Yeah, they're as much as it pains me to think of it, my insect friends are a very essential food source for so many other animals, birds and mammals and reptiles and amphibians. Yeah.
And I think a lot of people kind of got a bit of a fright nearly last year. I don't know. I've talked to a lot of people about it, and it just seemed like every summer you get that kind of influx of insects where one day you wake up and just like sitting beside a river like this, you'd be absolutely swarmed by little midges and flies and everything like that. And then when you're walking around the park, you would pretty consistently see butterflies and bumblebees. And I don't know about yourself, but last year I just noticed a lot less just in general biomass.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people have started to become a lot more concerned about it. And they're trying to do actions. So the things like you were saying, adding a small water feature or letting a little area of the garden go a little bit more wild. Is it something you've seen that people are starting to kind of care a little bit more about insects?
Definitely. When I'm out doing surveys, I often have people come up to me and say, there used to be so many butterflies around here. Or we used to see grasshoppers here and we never see them anymore. And they do sound genuinely sad about it. So yeah, I'm glad to be able to sort of give them a few tips then on how they can recreate habitat for those insects and bring them back.
Great. So there's obviously a lot of things that kind of everybody can do, but there are things that need to be done by professionals. So we're sitting here in, as you said, the kind of wet woodland area in the Dodder River just outside Fir House, and you've done a bit of work here doing surveys. Would you like to tell us the story of that and what you found?
I would love to. This site is very important to me. Here in the Dodder Wet Woodland, it's a strip of wet woodland in the middle of the Dodder Valley Linear Park. There is a rare beetle, which has only been recorded from this site and one place at Lough Neagh. In Ireland, anyway. I think it's in other countries as well, but in Ireland, it's only been in 2 spots. 10 years ago, I was commissioned to do a beetle survey along with another ecologist, Leila Higgins, and South Dublin County Council's Heritage Officer, Rosaleen Dwyer, who is an absolute legend, commissioned us to do a survey of the beetles here and then in a couple of other sites along the parks. We didn't actually find that rare beetle in that survey, but we did in a later one, so we know it's still here. After it was, I think, first recorded here in 1902.
Oh wow! Okay.
Yeah, I think Roy Anderson, who's an absolutely amazing entomologist from Northern Ireland, he also recorded it here in recent years. In Cherryfield, we found a couple of very uncommon beetle species that would be more typical of wooded fens.
Okay.
So kind of quite a different habitat. So that was a bit of a surprise. And it just shows like how good quality the habitat in this park is. It also shows that for beetles, the structure of a habitat can sometimes be more important than the actual specific plants that are in it. So the structure that's really important for the rare beetle that lives here on the river, which is called Bembidion andriae, is the gravel beds. So the gravel is kind of shaped by the river. It's sort of an ephemeral habitat, so the river will actually change the shape of the gravel beds and make sure that the vegetation doesn't encroach on the gravel, and then these kinds of beetles use this habitat for their very specific hunting needs, or to find the exact little types of nooks and crannies that they need to live in. We also found another tiny species called Trechus subnotatus, which is a relatively recent-ish arrival to Ireland, so it's now naturalized. It's been found in just a couple of other sites, so it's also kind of special to this place. One of the ones that we found in Cherryfield is a rove beetle that looks kind of like a wasp.
Okay.
So it has sort of black and yellow markings and reddish wing cases, and it mimics a wasp, so that things will think that it can sting, but it's actually harmless.
I was going to ask, so it's on purpose, like that it looks like this wasp. It's a defense system.
Yeah, exactly. Well,
So
I mean,
more than
we
likely.
can only guess,
Yeah,
but yeah, there are quite a few insects that look like stinging insects that can't. Hoverflies would be big ones for mimicking. And so, yeah, it's such a striking beetle, and I loved it so much. I did a painting of it on for the Dublin Canvas project in Terranure. So if you're driving through Terranure, you might see a big waspy-looking beetle on the traffic signal box.
So I know you were saying about the gravel and the fact that it's kind of shaped by the river. What was it that kind of allowed this area to stay as a natural habitat as compared to some of the other ones? What was it that made this little place special, do you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. Luck. I don't know. There was a lot of the riverbanks. So a lot of the gravel beds in the Dodder were quarried, so the gravel was taken away for use elsewhere. The gravel itself is quite interesting. It's glacial till, I think, and it's got different kinds of rocks from all over the place. But yeah, the gravel in a lot of areas of the Dodder has been quarried and taken away, and then in other parts of the Dodder, the banks have been
Kind of altered,
altered. So they've been built walls, or I don't know river terminology, but they're not natural anymore. So they don't have the kind of natural changing edges that the river has at this point in its course. Yeah, I think in the past there's been a fair bit of pollution in the Dodder, but lately I think it's doing pretty well. Yeah, that sort of natural hydrology and the natural shape of the edges of the rivers can't be underestimated how important that is for insects, different kinds of plants, and also for flooding mitigation. Like the vegetation along the edges of the rivers and the the way that it's kind of like a natural, gradual curve or slope is all really, really helpful for avoiding flooding. Yeah.
We kind of saw that here, even as we were walking up the kind of aftermath of the recent storms. We can see that there is trees that have fell over, but I mean, for the most part, the flooding wasn't all too serious along the Dodder here. It's kind of
Yeah.
retained its natural, I suppose, flood bank, and so there wasn't a huge amount of damage. Whereas in other areas where the areas are very controlled, whether it's through kind of river walls or just the removal of kind of riparian woodlands, the effects were a bit more serious.
Absolutely. And you can see from the trees that we saw that had been knocked down that the force of the floodwater was obviously really strong. And imagine then if the trees and the plants hadn't been
Yeah.
there, that like it just would have so easily burst the banks.
But I think it's the one thing that I find so incredible about specifically this location is there's an insect here that can only be found here and kind of the opposite side of the country almost, up in Northern Ireland at Lough Neagh, and yet we're a 5-minute or 10-minute walk from a shopping centre.
Yeah,
We're
it's
like right
crazy.
beside the Fir House shopping centre, and yet we have a really rare habitat. And I like what you were saying there about there are insects that can of course live in our garden and we can kind of promote them to come in, but there are areas like here that are completely specialist and certain species would only survive here. So do you think there's kind of not a higher value, I don't want to use that word, but there's almost a different conservation value to somewhere like this, such a specialist area, compared to just a back garden, which is never going to be really, it's never going to be a one-of-one habitat for an insect.
Yeah, exactly. It's irreplaceable, basically. You couldn't, like, if we lost these gravel beds, you couldn't sort of reconstruct them either, because you'd lose all the things that have grown up in here over thousands of years. There are other things. There are actually other rare beetles that I forgot to mention. There's one called, I think it's called Agathidium levigatum or something. And it's like it's just a really small little black beetle, but it can roll up in a ball like a pill millipede.
Okay.
And that's a rare species that's in these woodlands. The fact that the vegetation on the banks gathers sort of river refuse, like the bits of dead vegetation and rotting vegetation that the river pushes along, that refuse also provides habitat for rare insects. So another one of the beetles that we found, a rove beetle, whose name Quedius something. Quedius something is also a rare beetle that really likes to live in river refuse.
Okay.
So you couldn't recreate that in your garden or your
No.
park or just some random spot.
It's just so specialized to
Yeah.
specifically this location.
I've also seen, you're going to love this, a bright pink woodlouse here called...
Okay, cool. I'm
Yeah.
happy.
I can't remember the name, but it's called the rosy woodlouse. Its common name is the rosy woodlouse.
Are they rare?
It's not rare as far as I'm aware, but I've only seen it here and one other place, I can't remember where it was, but that was sort of in the alluvial, is that the right word?
Yeah. Like the river kind of
The
till.
alluvial till, indeed, on the banks of the river. Also, pseudoscorpions.
I've heard about this.
Yes.
I've never seen one. I've heard people say that there are some here, but I've never ever seen one. Are there any here?
There are. We found a few. Again, in that sort of the rivery soil.
I want to, yeah, because I talked to someone not long ago, and I was talking about scorpions, because apparently there are scorpions, wild scorpions at the docks that have kind of like escaped from various.
Seriously?
Yeah. And people go
Whoa.
out with UV lamps to try and find them.
Wow.
And I was talking to someone about it, and they were saying, "Oh, sure, you're from up by the Dodder, aren't you?" And I was like, "Yeah." And they were saying, "Oh, there's pseudo scorpions there," and they just told me this and dropped it in conversation very casually, and I was like, "Damn, I have to find one now." But yeah, apparently you can go with a UV torch and you can find around the docks. You can
Amazing.
find scorpions.
A
So,
lot?
I don't think it's a huge amount because people go out.
And collect them.
Yeah.
Right.
But they're definitely there.
That's outrageous.
And so just while we were talking about the kind of specialist habitats and really beautiful places like where we are now, I think I'll.
There's also some very uncommon water beetles in these waters. Like, I learned the name before I left the house.
Latin name.
Stictotarsus duodecimpostulatus.
Okay, fair play.
So that was one of the ones we found in our survey. Okay, that'll do.
That's fine. Yeah, so the final question, and the question that I always ask, and as I was saying to you before, some people find it a very difficult question and some people know it straight away. But it's just, what is your favorite place in nature? And it can be very specific to a one location, or it can be an entire ecosystem. So it can be as broad or as narrow as you'd like.
It's such a nice question. I think there will definitely always be a part of my heart in Madagascar. So there's a specific forest fragment that we were studying when I was the research assistant over there with Seed Madagascar. And it was called S7. I should know the Malagash name, but we or maybe the mining company called it S7. And it was one of the more remote ones. So we would go there for a week and we would camp just outside the forest, like literally just on the edge of the forest. And it was uphill from a big river. And at night, the fireflies would like blend in with the stars. So they would come up out at the edge of the forest and they would blend in with the stars. And it was the kind of place where if there was anything on my mind, if I was worried about anything or trying to figure something out, I would go up there for the week. We'd do our research, spend time with the very cool insects that were there as well, velvet ants and things like that. And everything would be solved in my head by the time we'd come back down to the main camp. It's a magical place. I hope it will still be there when I return.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
I think that's our most distant location.
Yeah.
Far. I think that's the, if we're plotting everything on a map, we've got an outlier now. But that's I mean, I wish we had fireflies here after hearing that. It's such a nice image.
It's also a nice spot for a very rare gecko called Phelsuma antonuche, which is it's endemic to that part of Madagascar, St. Luce area, and incredible colours, blue and green and red, and just
amazing to see.
Such an honour to see. Yeah.
Thank you for that answer, and thank you for giving up your time to come here and talk about insects for an hour.
Always my pleasure.
Is there anything that you want to kind of shout out, or anywhere you want to direct people to see more of your work?
Ooh, I've just made a video called Going Underground with Ants for the school's Nature and Climate Summit, Schools Climate and Nature Summit. And that is on their website and their YouTube. I just did a project with the Hunt Museum in Limerick.
Okay.
So we did some insect workshops with various community groups in the gardens, which surprisingly there's a lot of insects there in the middle of Limerick City. And we then created insects out of polymer clay, and put them around the garden to sort of draw people's attention to the insects that live there. So that there should be a video that I've made about that coming out soon as well. Otherwise, my YouTube channel, so Nessa Darcy Creative Entomologist, and my website, nessadarcy.ie.
So there it is, guys. Thank you so much to Nessa again for sitting with me and talking about insects for an hour. One thing that I didn't record was after we finished the podcast, Nessa was actually kind enough to do a kind of a demonstration sampling. Nessa had come along with a large sort of fishing net, and once we had finished our recording, we dipped the fishing net into the water and did a kind of kick sample. So a kick sample would usually consist of two people, one person downriver with a net, and then one person upriver, kind of kicking around the gravel and rocks on the river floor and getting some debris going. The person downriver then catches whatever's floating down, and it's emptied into a bucket. After you've done this, you can examine what insects you've found, And based on the species, you can actually make a very informed guess as to what the water quality of an area is like. We didn't do the kicking as it just wasn't appropriate for this time of year, but instead just swished the net around to see what we catch. By all means, we were quite impressed by what we found. Everything there was indicative of really good water quality, and for a river that's in the middle of housing estates and suburban Dublin, that's a really impressive thing. So of course, a massive thank you to Nessa for both the podcast recording and the little demonstration of sampling techniques. All the links mentioned by Nessa there will be found in the podcast description, including her website and some of her recent projects. I highly, highly, highly recommend going over and checking out the website and anything that Nessa puts out, because her passion for insects, which you've so clearly heard in this podcast episode, is visible throughout all of her work. And of course, as usual, I would like to thank you, the listener, for tuning in and giving some of your time over to nature. As mentioned in the last episode, I think now more than ever is such an important time to become educated in nature, and I just really appreciate you tuning in. So thank you for listening, and of course, try and get outside today.